So let me make just a few introductory remarks, and then I'll give over things to Doug and to Jim. Last Thursday discussion, I think a few things we need to maybe highlight, and one that bears repeating in this class, and that is class on faiths and globalization, is that faiths do not have monopoly on values, lest some of you who aren't of any particular faith think that that's being communicated in this class. But religions are, as I've said many times here, about self, social relations, and the good. And just because they're about those things, they are also about values. And I think it's important to keep in mind that religions aren't primarily telling people what to believe. They aren't primarily also telling people what to do. They're primarily kind of sketching the kind of world people inhabit, and therefore giving accounts of what it means to lead one's life well. And I think so also do various humanist perspectives. So also, I think the kind of set of values is embedded in kind of business practices, and also in the science, dominant modes of science that explains business practices in our economic life. I was talking to Doug over lunch yesterday about some of these things. Sure, values are embedded. I mean, that's exactly right. Even when they're not explicitly stated, selves as discrete individuals who are maximizing their own utility, one, social relations as kind of modes of contractual relationships. We are traders in wide variety of relationships that we have, as distinct from, say, in traditional societies where people saw themselves as fundamentally givers. Or remember this text that we read from Gita, right? Which is a text about fundamental relationship that you have to all people, and your whole reality is that of receiver of a gift and giver of gifts. And I suppose there is also embodiment of the idea of the good, efficient markets which maximize utility judged by revealed preference. And that account of self, that account of the social relations and the good, also has its own explicit end values that can be coded and are embedded because they're embedded in it. And sometimes then religious values and values that are embedded in markets themselves and business practices, they collide. And in that sense, I think we need to reflect also about the relationship between faith and globalization as it relates to markets. As I have suggested in our discussion last time, I want to differentiate between two ways in which values bear upon economic activity. One is, I said, internal functioning of the markets, and the two is kinds of values that are brought to bear on the purposes and the ends of economic activity. And I think that applies also not just to market as a whole, but certainly applies also to individual enterprises and to corporations. I will make two more sets of comments, and then I'll pass it on to Doug. And one is about values, worldly goods, and faith traditions, just to frame a bit more, continue framing a bit more what we're doing. And then the other one about what can be described as kind of spirituality of work, especially the text that we read on kind of Gita reflection of what it means to work well. Because that type of reflection is present in most faith traditions. We haven't done much with it, but it's a very, very important aspect of faith traditions. And I'll say just a few words about that. So values, worldly goods, and faith traditions. And I take it that from perspective internal to the functioning of the market or individual corporation or even globalization processes as a whole, faiths appear either as kind of dysfunctional, right, if they interfere with the processes as they are supposed to run, or they may be functional in the sense in that they're helping along. They may be either the sand or they may be oil in the larger machineries. So the important from that perspective is faith's functional utility. And goal might be then, of course, to reduce this function and to improve on function, right? Fate's utility might be consistent in that. But from the perspective of fates, that can be how things look like, right? Because the perspective of fates see themselves as overarching perspectives. And therefore, there's a strong resistance about thinking of fates simply in terms of their utility for whatever purpose it is that we have in mind. So I think fates more ask the question, how do we make sense of what we're doing? How do we evaluate what we are doing, which is kind of a moral assessment? How do we strengthen, amend, and transform, which is a kind of practical engagement issue? So that fates themselves see themselves as both providing the framework of meaning and also steering the processes, and that gives fates a certain kind of preachy characteristic, as I was discussing the other day with Joel about this, that they can appear as a kind of a moralizing, and this is annoying, especially if people of faith don't understand processes at hand, but then wag their fingers at you all the time, right? Then things become rather difficult, and resistances are great. And maybe that's why it's important to keep in mind that fates aren't primarily about commands. Fates are primarily about situating the self in the broader account of reality. And in many ways, I think many faiths would think, certainly Christian faith would think, that it's primarily not about following rules, but it's about perceiving life as a gift and one's own sense of giftedness and responsibility out of giftedness, rather than kind of structuring simply life as such. And in any case, I think this moralizing attitude isn't so terribly helpful. You know, I have been schooled, some of you, I mentioned, I think, to you that I've done my doctoral work on Karl Marx, right? And those of you who've read Karl Marx, you know the big debates between kind of utopian socialists and kind of scientific Marxists. And one of the big debates was, right, that utopian socialists, they were finger-wagging folks, right? And Marx, I think, rightly pointed out that you can't just wag fingers around against reality. You've got to kind of respect the inner dynamics and development of a reality. And I think that's what I suppose people of faith often need to be reminded of. Now, let me switch to the idea of spirituality of work. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a kind of long tradition in various faiths to think about work, particularly significance of work in human life, its relative importance, and work not understood simply as means to an end, although that too it is, but as a form of being human. Indeed, in some traditions, like in Christian Jewish traditions, and I think to some degree also in Muslim, as being form of likeness to divine creativity. Proper goals of work, what it is that is appropriate to achieve with work, and then the character of work as an action, often reflection of work as a form of worship, work as service unto the divine, right? And you see how work is then taken out of simple reference to oneself and placed into the, indeed, cosmic framework. I mean, tilling of the ground by a single lonely individual placed in the cosmic framework. You may say, well, that's, from certain perspectives, secular perspectives, certainly kind of lunacy, right? From other perspective, you can see how large of a sense of the self had that of its own situatedness and the implications of what is being done in this single repetitive kind of activity, I think, which is in many ways extraordinary. In the text that we've read from the reflections on work from the Gita, kind of sense of detached involvement. has been emphasized, and it's interesting to compare what's happening there with what in that text with what you find in some of the Abrahamic traditions. Non-detachment to the fruits of action, realization of one's higher self in the process of work, the whole reflection of what it means to actualize oneself, which self is this that is being actualized in work. And in particular, also this idea of work as giving, as exercise in generosity. At the table today, we were with TAs. We've been discussing. John has mentioned that in many ways you've got very opposite idea in some of the religious traditions from what you have in Adam Smith, right? You pursue work for others, and it's only so that the benefit of others is being achieved. But in Gita, it's very interesting, right? Remember there's one text where it says, well, when you give, you actually give not so to say to achieve the good, but the good gets to be achieved, so to say, behind your back as you're engaged in gift giving, because your life is inserted again in this cosmic framework where things are returned to you from other source, which you give in generosity toward others. You have similar notions, I think, in the Christian tradition as well. Though there, I take it that primary purpose of work is something like a betterment of world in service to God. And if you take a look at the first book of Genesis, first book of the Bible in Genesis, you will see something of that sort. Human work is there not simply to satisfy one's own needs, but to satisfy the needs of the community. And indeed, in this very interesting sense, human work is there, in a sense, to make the world itself a human world, which is you have an interesting piece about the story of the creation, which goes, and God created human beings and so forth, but there weren't yet vegetation wasn't yet there, because there was not, rain had not yet fallen, and there was not a man there to till the ground. So in a sense, in a very, if you want to say, naive form, you have explication of the need for there to be natural processes combined with cultural processes in order to create a human world. And I think that's idea of human work as directed toward the creation of a world as a habitat for humanity. Again, you see how widely stretched the idea it is, right? It's almost like a philosophy of history is embedded in it, rather than simply conception of work. I work in order to get a paycheck at the end of the week or whenever that comes. And that too is then inserted in the idea of work as calling and participation in divine work, right? That brings the question of values, but values not simply as, again, commands, but values as goals, values as large-scale perspectives into which our lives, including our economic activity, are always already seen as being inserted. I have less than 1 minute, and I'm done.